we were thinking we'd talk a little bit about who we are, some of the ground we cover in the book, and then hopefully have a really nice discussion. Yeah?
All right, sounds good to me, Zhana.
Okay.
You want to kick us off?
Yeah, so Jarrod and I go way back. We are currently both living in Chicago. We're visiting Seattle. We're doing the Pacific Northwest tour, making different stops. But we go back to, I would say, the Occupy era.
Yeah.
We met in New York City during the heyday of Occupy. Both of us were involved in kind of also the aftermath of Occupy, when people were going back into kind of neighborhood level organizing. I went back to the Bronx where I grew up, and I was part of an organization that was like doing grassroots organizing against police violence, for tenant rights, and just generally trying to shake things up in the Bronx. And yeah, Jarrod, you want to say?
Yeah, I was doing workplace organizing. It was cool to bring coworkers to Occupy, although I still had the distinct feeling of going to this place that just felt so urgent, and you're chanting another world is possible, and you really believe it, right? And then you take the subway back to your neighborhood, and you get off, and it's just a normal day in New York, right? And so we were acutely aware of the limits of this kind of this place-based convergence. And so afterwards, we tried a bunch of different experiments in struggles around social reproduction on the neighborhood level, or labor organizing in these little abortive collectives, right? That release a few statements, and then everybody hates each other, and you start over. And I think that the campaign that I remain the proudest of from that era kicked off around the tragedy of Trayvon Martin, which I think in a lot of ways is kind of the beginning of the moment that we're in now, for better or for worse, right? A lot of young people on the left relate their political awareness to this moment, and also a lot of young people on the political right trace their lineage back to the Trayvon Martin case. And so we were involved in organizing a lot of large demonstrations, convergences, in those early days of what would become the Black Lives Matter movement. And we really attempted to create a kind of confrontational, street-based politics that was also comprehensible and accessible to people who aren't already on the subcultural left, right? And you can guess how well that succeeded, but we tried.
Yeah, we tried, and I think in that way to kind of view like our moment in this like long historical arc that goes back to those days, the Trayvon Martin Organizing Committee and like the first major wave of Black Lives Matter, is like, man, the dial moved really, really fast, right? Yeah. I mean, being part of those protests kind of in at that time, like to have militant protest was really rare, right? It was, a lot of those first wave of protests, sometimes they were permitted, right? So to kind of have that massive first breakthrough of people taking over bridges, stopping traffic, right? Things that became very commonplace later on were pretty radical in those days, right? So I think in that way it's kind of interesting, the hindsight.
Yeah, at the event we had here yesterday, I told the story of a group of us had planned, following the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, right, in Ferguson. We said, okay, the next day after this, we're gonna block FDR, the big artery that runs north to south on the east side of Manhattan. And to any of our knowledge, that had not been done. At least in recent memory, and I thought that someone was going to get killed. I thought it was in my mind, it was the most militant action that I had ever planned to engage in, and I was really scared. I'm not going to lie, and then so we all got a good night's sleep that night, preparing to do this action the next day. But meanwhile, just some people that we had never heard of just went and did it themselves, right? People who had, gathered for the protest and decided to escalate. So it was a good reminder that, like, when you're on the subcultural left, sometimes you and your friends can like gas yourselves up about being the most radical and the most. But I mean, it's just something that was cool about 2014 was you saw all kinds of people who probably never read the coming insurrection or whatever, who were just out there engaging in what appeared to be a coming insurrection.
Yeah, and I think part of it, like at the time I was living in the Bronx and I was part of this group called Take Back the Bronx, and we had been organizing around like against police violence in different neighborhoods, cases that we heard, and we would go talk to the people in the neighborhood, and we would like, you know, have these, I think no cop zones, whatever, you know, stuff that
I thought they were cool,
you know,
at the
like,
time at least.
Where we talked to people
Yeah.
about police violence, and it was like amazing to see, as cheesy as a lot of it was. When I look back in hindsight, like something that I appreciated about that time was we had sometimes protests that allowed, like the first time that young people were at a protest where they were not being policed about what to do. So we hit against a lot of like the nonprofits that ran things in the Bronx, against kind of the local kind of leadership, political leadership that involved also a lot of the clergy, you know, a lot of like the peacekeeping. So that was like, I think, really important to kind of create those spaces outside of, you know, these like nonprofits, and you know, that where people felt like there was an alternative politics that was possible. So I think as cheesy as some of that was, I do think that that's still important, right? To kind of create those spaces where something different could be imagined, where people could participate in something, right? And that was like a cool thing to be part of that time. But you know, so both of us kind of know each other through this long history. You know, so through kind of the first wave of Black Lives Matter, up until kind of the 2020, and kind of in between that, we both became editors of Heartcrackers. We are in many ways one of our mentors, Noel Ignatieff, who recently passed away. That was one of his last political projects. Him, John Garvey, and others. So we kind of remained politically active, and tried to kind of do our best to be involved in things as they were happening, and also to contribute some type of, whether it was an analysis or thinking through with movements and activists as things were unfolding. And then I would say 2020 hit, right?
Yeah, and I would say, just to back it up a little bit, in the meantime, I mean, we both, as a lot of, you know, activist-minded people who are allergic to 9-to-5s end up doing, we just kept going to college and going to college and going to college until one day we were put in charge of the college classroom, and so we both became professors.
Yeah.
And as part of our professional work, Zhana has done fantastic work studying specifically the probation system. In fact, Zhana's input into the Hardcrackers project began when she wrote this awesome essay for it called "What a Waste of Time." And it was based on her experience studying the probation system in the South Bronx. She spent a lot of time talking to people experiencing that system, and I've learned so much from Zhana about.
Too kind.
No, for real. I said yesterday, the brains of the operation is not here. They've sent me to filibuster. No, I've learned so much from Zhana about the American punishment system and these supposed alternatives to incarceration. And Zhana's really helped me develop like what I consider to be a serious Marxist analysis of these systems, right? And in the meantime, I was doing a lot of my own work based on my own experiences, really just, I caught a case around the 2014 street movement. I won't go into the details, but I wound up seeing, you know, the inside of various police station basements and courthouse basements, and ended up going to Rikers Island for a little while and got to look at the Empire State Building from behind bars on this penal island. It was the most surreal experience of my life. And in the process, I just became very interested in the social history of these institutions, right, which of course bear the clear marks of having been in use for a very long time, right? And so I became very interested in studying the history of these institutions and really trying to theorize and historicize the role that they play in the production and social reproduction of social life. And so that project, which I worked on with my good friend Jack Norton, became the book Captives, How Rikers Island Took New York City Hostage, which is, believe it or not, is the first history of Rikers. And I learned
That's
that.
so crazy to think. Yeah.
Right, the whole project started when I went on Amazon. I shouldn't admit that, but I went on Amazon and I was like, Rikers Island history book, and I was ready to like one-click that, and it didn't exist. And I said, I can't even believe this. So anyway, so I approached this stuff from that side, just studying kind of the social history of these different institutions, right? And we both became involved. Do you want to say a little bit about kind of No New Jails and the skyscraper jails?
So, sorry, I know we're giving you a little bit of background, but I think it's also to kind of like situate ourselves and.
We're not just going to tell you what's in the books. You can read that. We're going to tell you what's behind the
that
books.
That way we also
right?
have a conversation about the things that you're all engaged in and stuff that we've been doing. So it's crazy, right, to think that a lot of times when we talk about the impact of social institutions on working class life, like jails, prisons, now conversations about policing because there was actual rebellion in America. American cities were burned down, right? But those are not things that most people associate with working class life, right? Especially when writing about it. So, I think that's a really central part of both the organizing and the writing. So, part of what also has been happening, so Rikers Island, kind of, right, this big, large penal complex in New York City, which is built away from where most people in New York City who live, are being sent to, right? They're living in the boroughs. As we know, jails hold most people who are pre-trial detention, right? So people are just really unable to afford bail, so they're being sent to Rikers. So all in all, I mean, there's this kind of really important story that happens while Jarrod and I are in New York and organizing. All of a sudden, Rikers Island, there's talk to start replacing it with these series of neighborhood jails. There's a lot of talk that Rikers Island is all of a sudden this big humanitarian crisis. City elites are finally realizing that it's a terrible, horrible place, right? So they're trying to kind of push this closure of Rikers Island and instead to replace it with these brand new skyscraper jails that they're going to build throughout the 4 boroughs. They're going to cost,
$10 billion. And I think what's interesting about the skyscraper jails, and we have a book that we're working on now about this, is that they were largely the brainchild of the nonprofit industrial complex. There was a very coordinated collaboration between the progressives in city government and well-funded nonprofit campaigns around reforming mass incarceration. So organizations that are funded by, Ford, MacArthur, all the names that they rattle off on NPR like every hour, right, had their fingerprints on this skyscraper jail campaign. And it's a really sad story because the campaign against Rikers, to close Rikers, began as an abolitionist campaign. Led by the brother of probably the most famous Rikers prisoner in recent memory, Khalif Browder, right? A young man who took his own life, unfortunately, after years of torture and solitary confinement at Rikers. And so you saw this campaign to shut down Rikers, generating a lot of enthusiasm, right? And the nonprofit industrial complex and the progressive Democrats in the city responded to this demand by crafting a campaign that was called Close Rikers, but in reality, it was a campaign to build skyscraper jails throughout the city. That, of course, if you know anything about the history of prisons, there's nothing new in this. They said all the old prisons are bad, all the jails are bad, but we know how to do it right. We know the humanitarian.
It's all about the light. We need more light. If prison cells had more light or better, like a culture change, right? Like prisons could be made better. So there's this kind of like long history of like prisons being an outcome of reform efforts, right? That if we could resolve the overcrowding by building nicer and better jails. So this kind of logic is at play. But I think it's important because for New York has for a very long period of time been this kind of like laboratory of a lot of major criminal justice reforms. And I think in many ways it ties to also a lot of what we do in the book.
Yeah.
That
There's a book. I forgot.
is that, I mean, we're kind of like, of course the book begins with the George Floyd Rebellion of 2020, but it feels a little weird to talk about it, right? Like in this moment, and I think we are essentially in this moment of reform and recuperation, right? Where obviously mass incarcerations, police, right? This has not ended, but what has been done is like some attempt to recuperate kind of that energy into some liberal reforms, right? And I think we see this most clearly when we talk about mass incarceration, right? There's kind of this willpower to reconfigure it and make it so-called more humane, right? So I think this attempt to kind of close Rikers and replace it with these neighborhood jails is part of this, right? And it's also part of this larger picture of like seeming as if there's like a new era in New York, right? Like Rikers and this terrible history of incarceration and violence and racism. I mean, let's be real. Most of the people that are locked up in Rikers are black and brown, right? So it's like that is going to be gone now, right? Like New York has, there's a new era, right? It's no longer going to be Rikers. It's going to be like a more humane version of incarceration. So I think there's kind of this new rhetoric of like a miracle New York, right? Just as people continue to experience heightened economic insecurity, rents are going through the roof. Like, I don't know, you need to be a gazillionaire to live in New York now. So it's like there's so much economic insecurity and messed up things. But look, Rikers is being replaced, right, with these jails.
Yeah, and one other kind of major trend that I think helps set the table for talking about the book is that you had basically beginning almost immediately after the uprising in Ferguson began in 2014, and even before that, around the Trayvon Martin case, you had the infusion of tens and hundreds of millions of dollars of nonprofit money into the what became known as the Black Lives Matter movement. And this fits a pattern going back to at least the 1960s. Specifically, if you read the history of the Ford Foundation, you can understand this history actually very quickly. It fits a pattern of progressive, liberal philanthropists looking at a movement like Black Lives Matter, identifying the players who are not threatening to business, and to just flooding them with money, right? All of the really unfortunate drama around Black Lives Matter's funding, right? It seems like a couple of people got their hands on the pocketbook and were buying themselves mansions or whatever, right? That's the result of what they used to call social engineering. Philanthropists who represent the ultra-rich, basically looking at a social crisis, identifying the people who could resolve it in a way that doesn't threaten capital, right? And just throwing as much money at them as they could. But I think that we have to be careful when we think about this phenomenon, because I think there's one approach to looking at these people who organize in the nonprofit sector and come out of the nonprofit sector that basically says, okay, this is the counterinsurgency. Everything they do is to defeat the movement, right? They're led from above, right? They march in lockstep with their masters in the Ford Foundation, right? And nothing can come out of this movement, right? This is basically anything that involves nonprofit money is bad, right? But I don't think that that's a dialectical understanding of what's happened in the U.S. in the last decade. I mean, you have a lot of people, young people came out of BLM, like thirsty for political involvement. And a lot of them started organizing with these nonprofit groups and getting jobs as staffers in these nonprofit groups, where they're talking about Assata Shakur this and Ruth Gilmore that. And I think that a lot of people are, they're looking for employment, right? They're looking for sources of political knowledge and political organizing, and they come to these nonprofits And they become an unstable compound, right? A lot of young folks got their input into things like abolitionism, anti-police activism, Black Power activism through the nonprofit sector. And so I think that we can relate to them in a more nuanced way by saying that their outcome, like their desired outcome by the people who fund nonprofits, is this kind of social engineering and social control. But you don't want to act as if they're always going to get their way, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of human beings involved in this story, right?
And we saw that, I think, with during the two waves of Black Lives Matter movements, right? I think a lot of young people who are looking for a political home, right? Who want to be involved in social change, and when we look around, right? Like, where are the institutions where people would go to those things?
Yeah.
They don't really exist, right? So people go to oftentimes the nonprofits because they're dressed up in language of social justice and change and transformation, and a lot of times often even revolutionary rhetoric, right? So people are drawn to them. But there were important breaks, right? Like I met, during both waves of Black Lives Matter, there were a lot of young people who, kind of started to like distance themselves a bit from that nonprofit world, and to start to see at least the limits of like organizing within that, right? But yeah, that's kind of an important layer, an important contradiction in the current moment, right?
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, speaks to this wider crisis. So in the book, something that we try to do a lot is to think about the summer of 2020 in terms of a wider social crisis in American life, right? A crisis of austerity and how people are responding to it. A social crisis that not only is met with repression in terms of policing, prisons, mass incarceration, but also a social crisis that often involves also moments of recuperation, right? Like liberal reforms, or like some aspects of the ruling class being able to dispense with something in order to offer some small concession, right? So all of this kind of being at play there.
Okay, so I think we've introduced all the moving parts that you'd find in the book. So maybe we can just say a little bit.
Yeah.
So the book that we're talking about is called States of Incarceration. It was put out on the Field Notes series on Reaktion Books, run by the fantastic Paul Maddock. As far as I'm concerned, Field Notes does not miss. The series is great. We're really honored to be on it. It grew out of an essay that we wrote on June 10th of 2020, right?
Very early.
Yeah, so Zhana and I had been, I was in Chicago, Zhana was in Knoxville.
Tennessee.
I was just like, oh my God, I'm seeing shit I never thought I'd see in my whole life. And you're just like, me too, And we started corresponding. We started collecting all the news we could find about what was going on. It was pretty clear from the beginning that we were in a fairly unique historical moment, right? And we just wanted to do our best, given our backgrounds, right? I mean, we've been through a wave or two of this. So we've been studying the police and the prisons, and we couldn't help but notice that police and carceral infrastructure were a central motif of the rebellion. People attacking police stations, police cars, the cops themselves. And we said, okay, we think we know a thing or two about where this is coming from, where it might be going. So we wrote this essay basically outlining how the rebellion has played out so far, what we think is really cool and kind of radical about it, and ending by saying, but there is a chance, right, that this emphasis on abolition and defunding the police or whatever could really lead the movement just back into the very halls of power that people are now currently trying to fucking light on fire, right? I wasn't exactly, a genius prediction, right? But so anyway, the article came out and we were offered the opportunity to write this book.
Yeah, so basically to kind of take a step back, because I think there's something about, right, as many of you may have experienced too, there's something about participating in like the street level activity and the militancy too, that was very unprecedented, to say the least, right? that makes one really feel the beat. So I think when everything subsided, and then maybe a sort of depression kind of sets in, that you're also able to take stock of everything that happened and have like a sober analysis of it, right? So I think, so I think in that way, it was, so I think we wanted to stay faithful to what happened and what we saw, right? Because I think that's important, right? It's like to meet movements where they're at, not to where we want it to be, right? To understand that while there were like external limits, there were also internal limits to the George Floyd Rebellion. So we can't just like blame these external forces, right? So to kind of really take stock of what happened, but also to like really foreground the militancy, because here we are like 3 years later, so much has happened, right? It seems like weird to even think back to that era, right? And also now like so much in terms of like right-wing craziness has set in, right? That, it kind of, it clouds a lot of that, and it leads to even more amnesia, I think.
Yeah, and I think Zhana's right. I will say that if anyone here has ever written about a movement while they're participating in it, you're bound to write some things that are going to embarrass you later. But honestly, that's fine, because it's how you were feeling. It's how everything felt. I recently reread this essay that I wrote in 2014, and it began by saying, "The American proletariat is on the move." And I was just like,
this was the first.
Some of them,
That actually sounds good.
Yeah, all right, I'll send you the essay, but so, I mean, I think that you are responsible for, being faithful to the period, right? And to the moment that you're trying to write about. And so I think Zhana's correct that the purpose of the book was to really capture this militancy, right? I mean, Americans, right, like they like to talk a lot of shit, right? But like when it comes time to collectively struggling around really awful austerity, human disposability, right? Americans can be pretty meek, right? They're prone to individual solutions, right, to these collective problems, right? And the kind of militancy that we saw was like people lighting cop cars on fire, people like the police stations getting attacked and lit on fire. I don't need to tell you all here in Seattle, right? For better or worse, there were people doing some real dicey shit out there in the streets, right? And what we saw early in the rebellion, right, and many people predicted this, the reactionary counterinsurgency, like the Trump and the Fox News approach, was to emphasize the militancy, right? So Chop Chaz, right, was famous on every Fox News grandpa all over the United States knows about this lovely little boutique block that we just drove through, which seems fine, right? So the reactionaries were going real hard on emphasizing every militant act, every assault, every looting, right? But the liberal version of it was to just completely erase that. In a way that you could, for once in history, you could get more accurate coverage on Fox News than MSNBC, because they weren't showing any of that stuff, right? And so we wanted to recapture that. We were like, no, this was a time when Americans did something that they don't often do. And it might not have been, revolution, right? But it does it gives us a glimpse at what we can kind of anticipate in terms of, future struggles, right? And as we find ourselves in this period of kind of recuperation, you could call it a lull period. I can hear the voice of Adam Curtis saying, "Was it all a dream?" I think it's worth kind of thinking about the contours of what we saw in terms of what we can expect in the future.
Yeah, and I think something to kind of add to that too is that it wasn't just kind of this like right wing versus liberal like ideas about the rebellion. I think there were a lot on the left who maybe wished that the rebellion had unfolded differently. I mean, many of us wish different, and we should ask that question, right? Like, what could have happened had people been organized in XYZ fashion, right? Like those, I think that's a really valid question, right? But meaning, like, I think there's like some tendencies among like some socialists or leftists to say, oh, this is just like protests about police violence. Like these are not like class struggles in the traditional sense. And we wanted to really like take that on and say, like, these are, that the George Floyd Rebellion was an important part of how class struggles are happening in the United States and have been happening for a while. Since the 60s, one thing we could really count on is American cities going up on fire to protest racist police violence, right? So why is that, right? Why is that a recurring thing that continues to happen?
Yeah.
And I think in the book, we're very clear, and something we talk a lot about in terms of kind of like looking at the George Floyd Rebellion as also an example of what austerity struggles in the United States look like, right? So it's not just the United States. George Floyd Rebellion really kind of is the United States version of kind of this global struggle, right? If we look at what's happened with Arab Spring, with protests unfolding throughout the rest of the world, right? So kind of in like some of the chapters of the book, we kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, how can we understand policing, anti-policing and anti-prison struggles as class struggles in the United States, right? As parts of like these anti-austerity struggles, what has happened in American life in the ways in which the capitalist state has transformed since the 1970s that make these struggles important and things that we're going to continuously see. So how do we orient them to them, right? And how do we, as leftists, revolutionaries, activists, start to, bring things together, gel things together, right? Because the pandemic was really this moment where things could have gelled, right, in certain ways too, and they didn't. They hit real limits as well. So I think it poses really important questions, right, to folks involved in movements.
Yeah, in practical terms, I think one of the main political interventions that we were trying to make is as follows, right? We recently did one of these events, and somebody asked us, well, don't you think that the George Floyd movement picked the wrong demand, right? Like, these people were mad about the cops, but don't they understand that the real problem is capitalism and class, and there's this whole kind of resurgence of like vulgar class reductionism that you see on like the Jacobin side of the left, right? And we were like, sure, maybe that's correct on like a term paper about Marx or something, but you don't get to pick what sets off mass struggle. You can agitate like hell all the time, right?
And people do. They have the newspapers on the corner, that has not willed revolution.
If the revolution could be won on will alone, we would be living in a Trotskyist utopia right now, right? But seriously, you can agitate like hell. You can push your version of what's fucked up about reality. And I think abolitionism actually demonstrates how successful you can be, right? Because there have been these small crews of abolitionists throughout the U.S. and the world, for the last at least 20 years since the resurgence of abolitionism, pushing this idea. Mass incarceration is wrong. Mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. We got to close jails. No new jails, right? And you can see that they actually get pretty far, right? When people take action in these big moments of austerity, right, when they're really feeling the crunch, right, and they're trying to come up with a name or a reason for why they're doing what they're doing, bodies of politics like abolitionism are in position, right? But ultimately speaking, most revolutionaries do not have control over the circumstances under which these movements begin, the issues that are going to animate them when they start, right? All you can really do is figure out how you're going to orient to them, when they kick off, right? And so to our mind, it's like the wrong question to say like, oh, well, why is it that they were so wrong? Why are people focusing on cops when they should be focusing on their bosses? It's like, let's do it backwards. What is it about policing, right? What is it about incarceration? What is it about looting, right? And the imperative to just ransack these stores, right? That tells us where working class people are at politically, and where things could be headed toward a revolutionary horizon.
Yeah, and it's like here we have an example where there's a mass movement that was oriented towards illegality.
Yeah.
Very good, right? Like that's like a moment where I think activists and revolutionaries like have to engage with, as opposed to saying, well, no, that's not the correct way in which class struggle should unfold, right? So we, that in that way, we kind of like really wanted to meet the movement where it was at, right?
Yeah.
And then also recognize that in the course of it, right? I mean, I think we spent a lot of time engaging with abolitionists, right? Because this was an important political imagination and a political milieu that emerged out of the George Floyd Rebellion, right?
Yeah.
And I think it captured pretty well what austerity meant, right? That for a lot of people, it meant there is kind of, that the state has been hollowed out in this way, not in the sense that it doesn't exist, but is no longer providing any social benefits or social safety net, right? But now it's just like this punitive, repressive state that comes to you in the form of more cops with shiny new toys, as more neighborhoods are like defunded, disinvested from, right? And so abolition really captured that through this demand of defund, right? Where the idea was that, there is this unevenness in what the state is funding and investing in.
And it's so fucking obvious, right? You drive, I work in the south suburbs of Chicago, and you have some towns that are just, the buildings are just falling down. They've basically just been abandoned by capital and by the state and federal government. But the cops still have SUVs, brand new SUVs, right? People see that. It's so obvious. In 2020, I was like, why does the Kenosha, Wisconsin Police Department have 2 tanks, right? It's amazing, right? It would be funny if it wasn't so scary, right? And so, we tried to relate to abolitionism. We come out of kind of an abolitionist tradition, right? We tried to relate to the mainstreaming of abolitionism as a large opening, it's a big opening, right? I know we run in some circles where some of our comrades were like, no, the abolitionists are co-opting the struggle. No, don't they understand that we need to be talking about communism, not abolition? But I just think that that's a little short-sighted. I mean, personally speaking, I'm very happy that there's way more abolitionists than there used to be. That if you want to be the cool kid in your undergrad class and you want to be trendy or whatever, you want to call yourself an abolitionist, that's great, But let's talk about what that actually means concretely, right? And this kind of led us to the final chapter of the book, which is, I think, if you're going to read one chapter, I'd say make it that one.
Yeah. Skip to chapter 5, guys.
No, the rest of it's
good because it's kind of where we engage with the main arguments in abolition, right? Kind of going through its history, where it comes from, and also in many ways, Jarrod was talking about, we have an affinity to it. It's abolition in the United States kind of usually people think of it in terms of the 1960s, 70s Black Power era. But, abolition has this kind of very, much longer historical arc, right? Going back to the 19th century, the abolition of slavery. So I think it's a really important, it's an important, I think, historical trajectory even to look at its history, right?
So the wager we offer in the book, is that, whether or not you think that abolitionism should be one of the major paradigms politically right now, it is. On the left at least, right? And I feel the need to actually correct one thing that we said in the book. At one point we say abolitionism won the George Floyd Rebellion. Okay, well, neoliberal technocracy won the George Floyd Rebellion as it wins everything. But from a left perspective, abolitionism won the George Floyd Rebellion, right? And so abolition is mainstream now. Miriam Kava is on the New York Times bestseller list. Ruth Gilmore is getting these profiles everywhere. Members of the liberal elite are feeling the need to attack them. That's when you really know, right, that they're starting to make people sweat. And so we thought that the most productive way to engage with this is through an immanent critique. And to say, let's craft the most favorable, generous version of abolitionism that we can, right? And trace its history through the anti-slavery movement, through the black and brown power movements, the revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s, right? Up through a lot of really righteous and cool anti-prison, anti-cop movements in the last 30 years, right? And let's see how far that goes, and then let's just see where it falls short,
Yeah.
right?
And just to say, we're not the only ones kind of like trying to rescue that revolutionary meaning of abolition. Joy James did this.
Yeah.
And we're, so there are a lot of people also that we're like in conversation with that are trying to kind of, trace back this like revolutionary meaning, but also its relationship to the state, right? Its relationship to the kind of power that abolitionism seeks to build, right? So in calling into question what is a world without jails and prisons and police would look like, which is to say a world without capitalism, right, in many ways, what would it take us to get there, right? Like, what is the kind of power that we're trying to build? What are the kinds of anti-capitalist organizations that we would need to get there, right? So it was kind of like engaging in dialogue with abolitionists to start thinking about these things beyond just the politics. A lot of times abolitionism is phrased like in the politics of like an imagination, which is important. Imagination is crucial, right? To be creative, to think of another world. That's amazing, right? But then concretely, what would that mean, right? What would it, so that's kind of what we wanted to engage with, right? To get beyond just like this idea of the horizon, but like in practice, right? Like what are kind of the collectives? And it's not to say that abolitionism is not short on collectives, right? There's so many ways in which it has historically and even in the current moment organizes against carceral frameworks or ways, right? But what is the kind of power that is seeking to build, right? Like, is it a power that's going to take on the state, that's going to be working at the margins of the state and kind of off the grid, kind of, right? These are some of the questions that we were posing.
Yeah, and a political tendency's strengths are often its weaknesses. And I think with contemporary abolitionism, this is very true. Contemporary abolitionists are very good at the kind of bread and butter local campaigns to stop jails. They're very good at doing things like prisoner support, which if you've ever done prisoner support, it's extremely demanding work. I mean, if there's a heaven, everyone who does jail support and letter writing, they're all going there, right? It's extremely demanding, stressful, emotionally draining work. Abolitionists have distinguished themselves in campaigns like that. Local initiatives at social reproduction, getting people food and housing, getting people, mental health care, all of these things, right? And it is the practical emphasis that abolitionists have on the local context, right, that constitute one of the main strengths of the tendency, and why they are able to speak so compellingly to how fucked up our society is, right, because they know, right? But when it comes to bridging that work to a transformational political vision, most contemporary abolitionism falls short, right? Like, Zhana raised some really important questions, like, how are you understanding a post-police society, right? Everybody says we want a society without cops, right? We also, same. But like, do you think that we can get there through liberal democracy? Do you think that we can get there through voting for progressive politicians, right? Through all these local initiatives to defund the police, so on and so forth? Do you think that we need to abolish capitalism, right? Which we do. And if you think that that's true, do you think that that can be accomplished peacefully? Do you think that can be accomplished through liberal democracy? Do you think the most powerful ruling class in history is going to give up the keys, without a fight, right? And so these are the questions that we're challenging our abolitionist comrades to take seriously. And while it may seem abstract, right, I think one of the lessons from 2020 is actually it's not.
Yeah.
Right? We saw large numbers of people out in the streets taking direct action, attacking police infrastructure, occupying space, right? A week before that, very few of us would have predicted that they'd be seeing that sight, which means that a week from now, we could be seeing shit like that happen again, right? And I think it's really important to have these conversations about how exactly we imagine what we're going to have to do in order to bring a post-capitalist society into being.
Yeah. And I think, in the past 3 years, also the terrain has been even more muddled, right? I feel like, as we're like literally trying to hold on to like basic human rights.
Yeah.
So I think there's like an added, obviously an important part of all of this, right? With like the growing far right, that adds attention. But I think kind of this relationship of movements to the state, right? Something that I think I really appreciate about like abolitionists is like kind of, the focus on transformative justice, on like community. But as we know historically, these are all things that have been very easily recuperated by the state, right? As Jarrod mentions, like the history of kind of these foundations, right? Or of community control, right? Has been one in which the state has been really, has been able to kind of recuperate, right? Like, what is community? Who is community? Who belongs? It's such a nebulous, unclear concept often, right? Even though it's something that all of us like strive to build, right? Yeah. What do we mean? Like, are we in community with the police? Are we in community with our bosses? Are we in community? I mean, I hope not to be, but so are we in community, right? So I think it kind of like I think it helps to start drawing some like lines in the sand, right? Like, what are we for? What is kind of the vision that we're trying to build? And I think something like Jarrod, you mentioned, is like George Floyd Rebellion made something so abstract really concrete, right? Like in a moment, abolition became so like it was mainstream. It became something that people were for or against, right? And overnight, people had to have a position, and I think that's amazing. Right, to kind of see that. So, it kind of like it brings into focus these questions, and also, is abolition going to continue? What is its relationship to the state, right? Is it going to be able to hold this like extra, like outsider perspective, right, where it could like push on the state, or is it going to be, suffused within the state and trying to work within, right? Like what is movement's position to the state, right? As we build movements and as we build power, I think historically the movements that have been most successful have been the ones that have always maintained a very healthy distance from the state, right? And have not worked with it.
I mean, I've learned that from reading a lot of really great abolitionists. Like Beth Ritchie has this excellent book called Arrested Justice about the history of the anti-domestic violence movement. And how it began as the grassroots effort of working class black women who were consistently frustrated that nobody was taking domestic violence seriously. And she tells the really sad story of how their efforts to build up resources for domestic violence victims, right, basically became the pretext for just locking up a whole lot more people and further destabilizing the communities that they came from, while providing absolutely no support for the survivors of domestic violence, right? And that's just one example and so abolitionism actually provides a rich canon for understanding the challenges and the pitfalls of relying too much on the state for any kind of liberation. I mean, the Revolution Will Not Be Funded remains kind of a classic book. We have a few critical notes about it in our book that you're going to have to read to chapter 5 to get, right? The Insight volume, The Color of Violence, remains like just canon, right? And so a lot of this work has already been done. But I think that really moving forward, we should really use 2020 as a point of reference for the kind of thing that we can expect in the future. I mean, I had this moment. I mean, I was in Kenosha when those people were murdered, and I was actually standing about 15 feet away and beheld the scene, and it was awful. And there's running away from armed vigilantes shooting at us, and cops in tanks, and I had an umbrella, and I was thinking like, wow, this is what it was always going to be like. right? So I've spent my entire political life saying, with this kind of macho accelerationist line, like we got to push the contradictions. We got to push, oh, this demo is too tame. Oh, these people aren't radical enough, right? And it's like, well, here you go, motherfucker. You wanted this. Here you are. There's people getting shot. There's a whole lot of the cops are heavily armed. They're taking you very seriously now. The vigilantes are taking you very seriously now. And so this is here it is. You got the nightmare of desire is its fulfillment, right? And so I think that we need to be thinking in those terms, like this kind of want to talk about struggle and liberation and revolution, and like, yeah, I mean, if you're not careful, you just might get it, right? And you just got to be thinking about how you're preparing right now for those moments.
Yeah.
Have we talked enough?
I think we've talked a lot.
Yeah.
So let's end it there.